Invest Africa, proudly brought to you by KPMG.
And welcome. This is Invest Africa and I'm your host Nozi Pumbanjwa. Thank you for joining us. Now, Africa's growth is a huge draw card to international investors, and as the continent expands, the role of procurement is becoming increasingly strategic in relation to infrastructure, finance, energy, mining and other sectors. But ineffective procurement is costing Africa an estimated $31.5 billion. Joining me now in studio to discuss where and why this value leak is happening is Dr. Dinesh Kumar. He's an Associate Director and Head of Procurement Advisory at KPMG. Lillian Karuri-Magero, she's the South African Head of Sourcing at Barclays Africa Group Limited. And Andre Kutsia is the Managing Director at SIPS Africa. Now, for you at home who would like to join in the conversation by using Twitter and following me at Nozi Pumbanjwa or at CNBC Africa, don't forget that our hashtag is Invest Africa. Thank you so much for making the time to join us. Andre, let's start off with you. Why should procurement be considered a strategic part of any business? It doesn't seem to have enjoyed that label for many, many years.
Well, no, you're 100% right. And I just thought I'll just share something with you. Barlow World Logistics recently did a very good survey where they surveyed CEOs and C-suite people in organizations, and also across all industry and big business. 27% of that survey, 5 billion rand turnover and more, and they were asked their top 10 supply chain objectives, and procurement was number 2, indicating that procurement is becoming more and more important and strategic for bottom line performance in the eyes of CEOs.
Is Barlow World an outlier? Or is it the norm that you would see procurement ranking so high in terms of strategic importance?
Well, Barlow World Logistics only did the survey, so it was across industry. So it's not a Barlow World point of view. It's actually across all industries, showing that CEOs and decision makers within business are recognizing the strategic value of procurement and supply management more and more.
Dinesh, and yet, despite this, a value leak in the billions of US dollars. How do we marry the two pictures that are being painted?
So Nozipo, and I think building up onto Andre's comment as well, so while the procurement is seen as kind of a strategic function which is coming back into business, 73% of the C-suite executives still feel procurement is adding no value in the business. So I think there's a long road for us to travel. Some of the challenges we have is very much around the strategic nature of the procurement in the organization is not seen in that light as seen as a finance or a business task or a sales force in there. Procurement is seen as a backbone function that sits at the back trying to support the internal organizations of the functions. So that's where it's still I'll say, long road to travel on that side.
If we were to see this long road being traveled and perhaps the picture that Andre painted where we're seeing an increasing importance, Lillian, in procurement, what value addition does procurement bring to the business?
Tremendous, Nozipo. I think tremendous. I've been in this industry more than 16 years now, and I see opportunities where not only does the procurement and supply chain function help the bottom line of the business, help the organization be more profitable, be more commercially astute in its engagement with its partners, develop partnerships as opposed to transactional relationships with its supply base. I think it's tremendous value that it brings to the organization, Nozipo.
So before we start talking about how do we plug this leak, maybe let's get a clearer understanding of why does it happen? And Andre, maybe let's start off with you. Why are we seeing such a huge leakage of funds through the supply chain and procurement process?
Well, I think, as Dinesh also mentioned, that it hasn't been strategic enough. So what you actually find is that a lot of people that actually practice procurement or supply management are not really equipped to do that. And so I think that plays a huge role. And also, obviously, the big F word is fraud, that always sort of finds its way in procurement and into supply chain. So I think it's a combination of a lack of skills, and I'm sure we'll touch on it a little bit later, but also, some leakages through fraud and corruption, in the supply chain.
Dinesh, are the pictures, and I know you want to come back to what Andre just said, and when you do, perhaps also just to help us understand whether the same holds in terms of the trends in the leakage that you're seeing for the private sector as it does in the public sector.
Okay, so Naziba, the twofold questions that you're asking me is definitely to comment back onto the Andre's ones. So I think to comment on the value leak, which is $31.5 billion US, which is more than a GDP of few of the countries in Africa as well. This is a sizable amount. So as Andre mentioned, definitely fraud and corruption is that. But I think it's basic understanding of the procurement as such. Like a lot of the organizations don't even have policies, even to start looking at the fraud to track from there. We talk about some of the facts such as like 56% of those ones don't even track any benefits that procurement bring to the organizations. So that's why they lack top executive support to bring that one out as well. Technology, I don't think we adopt as equally as the European or the US counterparts does to curtail certain kind of spend or leak that happens in the procurement organizations as well. So there is definitely that's there. Now to compare it to the private sector, definitely I think a lot of learnings that are between the public and private are not shared in the African context. I think there are still two parts of the world that we are running into the African perspective as such. While there are a lot of efficiencies coming from a private one, those doesn't get rolled on to a private sector or a public sector environment. The good thing about, and I don't want to spend too much time on this one, is to really talk about like, while public is more on compliance still, private is focusing very much around latest trends and efficiencies, which are two different goalposts to target.
Lillian, I see you agreeing to Dinesh. Any addition on that point?
See, I've really had the unique opportunity to actually work on both sides of the field, both public sector and private sector, and I completely agree with what Dinesh is saying. I think more often than not in a public sector environment, the wheels turn very slowly. And so ability to adopt technology and bring that into the procurement and supply chain field happens very slowly, not because there's no intentional or need or understanding of the importance of that, but just happens by far more slowly. Whereas in the private sector environment, that wheel turns a lot faster. I do think that more collaboration between public sector and private sector to find ways to bridge that time gap that happens, which has tremendous impact on the economy, is extremely key.
Sure. Yeah, and I can't agree with you more. I think if there's one profession that can really change the course of Africa, and I think in your introduction you alluded to Africa as an investment destination, is the procurement and supply profession. Because in many of the African countries, a lot of the spend is still coming from government or public sector spending, and if that is harnessed and if that happens efficiently and effectively, it can play a huge role in developing small and medium business in those countries.
Andre, maybe let me come back straight to you with this question. We've also seen procurement being used as a vehicle to drive transformation. To what extent is this a field where companies find it's easy to navigate and the rules of the game are clear, or is it a little less clear as I'm putting it?
I think you know, the rules are probably clear, but a lot of organizations struggle to sort of work that into their plans and their strategy. I think it's a good thing. You know, if you look at something like supplier development, it's not unique to South Africa. It's unique across the world, but especially Africa. A lot of the countries that we go to, they just name it something different, but it all comes down to localization, supply development through procurement and supply chain efficiencies.
So if I may just jump in there, Nizipo, I think you raise a really good point around supplier diversity and supplier development, and I want to come back to that. But I think that a more important point that I don't want us to miss is you're asking, are we interacting in a way that makes the organization understand clearly the value add and makes interaction with procurement and supply chain very clear in terms of its presence, why it's there, and why it's important. And I think we still have some way to go. When I really think about the environments in which I'm in, the language that we speak still is not clearly understood by the organization. The acronyms that we use, how we define the value and the benefit that we deliver back to the business is still convoluted, it's complex. We need to simplify it so that the value is very clear and it's well understood.
I want to come back to the issue that I think Dinesh raised earlier about tracking to you, Lillian. But before we do that, does leveraging of procurement to drive transformation make sense?
So, Nizipo, that's a very good question to ask. And I think at this stage where we are spending so much money in the country, so if you talk about South Africa, we're going to spend roughly 310 billion as part of the investment over the next 4 to 5 years. I think as President Zuma mentioned about that one. If you talk about spend into Africa, we're talking about roughly $50 billion spent going into that one. So there's a lot of spend happening down there. I think with that potential of that spend going there, with the power of liaisons and relationship that you can build up and the kind of efficiencies you can drive, it definitely makes a sense for procurement to be one of the driving force for the transformation, because it has got that power, in public sector at least. In private sector, I think, as Linian and Andre has mentioned as well, like, they are doing that one on their own, but it's not a collective effort. So if, let's say, Anglo-American of the world or Cecil of the world are doing fantastic, but then there are other organizations that can leverage from similar learnings as well. So there's not a shared learning that's happening in public sector from that perspective.
I have interviewed countless entrepreneurs who will tell you that they always get stuck in the peripheral or secondary parts of the business when it comes to procurement. Your catering services, your cleaning services for companies, and they're all trying to get their foot in to get into the mainstream or the core of the business. Is that even a possibility, especially when we're looking at previously disadvantaged people in South Africa who have latched onto this idea that through the supply chain, through the transformation agenda, that they're going to be able to get a foot in as active citizens when it comes to playing in the economy? Is this even happening, Lillian? I
can tell you for a fact it is. Is it happening fast enough? Probably not, Nazipo. But that it's happening, absolutely it is. What I can tell you is that the suppliers and the entrepreneurs who are more successful are the ones who are very clear and articulate about the value proposition that they bring. They understand their product, they understand the client environment, so they understand how to best plug in. But I certainly can tell you it is happening. The organizations that I've supported are extremely supportive of that. And I can tell you, especially through the SIPS environment, where we have an entire program around developing suppliers so they better understand how they position themselves for success.
Your experience, Andre, working with some of these suppliers, do you get a sense that they feel that they are, in a sense, benefiting from the procurement agenda that we have in the country?
I think more and more they actually feel that. I think I agree with Lillian. It's probably not happening fast enough, but there's certainly a huge focus on that, so it is happening. And the interesting thing is, and that's always a test, you know, if you look at small business and the opportunity to get involved in procurement or supply chain opportunities, we just came back from a summer school, a conference in Zambia, and there was a gentleman talking about Buy Zambia. So we just did a quick test because they sort of had T-shirts there that all the people could sort of purchase after the conference. And we then said, okay, can we just check the label? And guess what? It was not made in Zambia, in Zimbabwe. It was made in China, and I'm not saying that it shouldn't, but I think that's just it's a mindset. Yeah. You know, and that's coming back to your question. So yes, the procurement environment can play a huge role. We just need to think differently about these things.
Is that all it is, Dinesh, thinking differently?
So, Nozipo, I think that makes sense. So I think if you're talking about the transformation initiatives in this country or in this continent as well, the majority of that one sits in a small and medium scale sectors. We are not talking about the big players already in the market. They are doing it fantastically. The question is very much around the small players that are active, and we need to bring them as part of the puzzle on there. The two things which are hindering that process is definitely around policies and governance. So I think we are too restrictive on one side. So I think we have got one of the best procurement regulations in the country, all such, across the world. But to make it effective on the ground, I think we lose the traction as well. So how to translate a policy into a practical working guideline for a small scale industry to work with, we don't have the translation yet. So while we want to bring the small guys into play, we have created the structure, but that whole transition is still lacking.
From policy to practice, it's time for a quick break, but when we come back, more on procurement in Africa. Welcome back to Invest Africa. Tonight we're looking at procurement in Africa. Remember that we do value your suggestions and your feedback, so please send us an email to investafrica@abn360.com or talk to us on Twitter, following me @NoziPumbandra or @CNBC Africa, and don't forget our hashtag, that's Invest Africa. Still with me, my guest, Dr. Dinesh Kumar, Associate Director and Head of Procurement Advisory at KPMG. Lillian Karuri-Magero, she's the South Africa Head of Sourcing at Barclays, Africa Group Limited, and Andre Kutsia, Managing Director at SIPS Africa. Welcome back. Andre, let me put you on the spot first, and let's talk about track. I mean, Lillian put this on the table, and the question then becomes, do we have the right tools to track procurement so that we're in a position to make that call whether we're seeing value addition or not?
Well, I think, if you look at globally, there are certainly a lot of tools available to do that. The question, however, is, and I think Dinesh touched on it earlier, some organizations still today don't see it as very strategic, so they don't even have procurement plans or strategy, never mind tracking the whole thing. So to answer your question in a nutshell, yes, there are a lot of tools and techniques that people can use, but if it's being used, that's another question. Certainly the leading organizations do use that. And then again, the laggers probably don't. For
the medium-sized and small businesses maybe watching this show right now and thinking, where do I start? How do I begin the systems and processes that Dinesh said might be missing, working towards the tools?
So even if an organization is too small or doesn't have enough capital to invest in the tools, at a bare minimum, the KPIs of your procurement function must be the KPIs of the C-suite. They must be the KPIs of the overall organization. And then the second piece is that the benefits that procurement is delivering within a medium or a small organization must absolutely be tied to the bottom line performance of the organization.
Dinesh, let's move on to risk. And I know you've had a comment, so let's take your comment before we head into risk.
Right. So Nazipo, I think linking to Andre's and Lillian's comments, very much around, I think if you're talking technology, there are one or two good examples in South Africa as well, who are using best of the best breed of technology on procurement space altogether. But if we talk about wider Africa, I think the challenges are really lost up to there. So if you're talking about, let's say, donor funding, so if one of the US donor fund organizations wants to invest and put money into Africa, they want to track every cent they're going to spend in the continent through a proper tracking tool, not only on the benefits, but even the general spend as well. I think that's where we lack a lot in the continent from there. Now, coming to your second issue in terms of risk, I think the one big aspect we haven't, like we are looking at the low maturity of the organizations at the moment. So when we define maturity at three scales. We define it at like it's a survival mode, or it's optimized, or it's a sustainable mode as well. A risk becomes very much evident or applicable in a sustainable mode of maturity. In the supply chain setups and procurement setups in Africa, we are very much in survival and optimize. So we haven't looked at risk angle so far. We are very much battling with the issues of efficiencies, compliance, effectiveness, governance altogether. So I think I'll say it's still a dream for next 6 or 7 years for us to start looking into risk before we start getting our baseline right.
Andre, in response?
Yes, I can agree to that. But you know what, if you look at technology, that's only an enabler. You need good people, you need professionals to actually drive that technology. And I think that is also a huge problem. Because of probably the lack of maturity, you find that in the procurement profession, anybody can actually practice procurement. If you're a medical doctor, you have to have an underlying qualification, and I think that is where we play quite a big role to make sure that the people that call themselves procurement or supply chain professionals actually do have the underlying skills to back up what they say.
So you're saying the pipeline in terms of the skills necessary to give the procurement space the capacity that is required is lacking?
Well, I'm not saying the pipeline, because we're working very hard to actually feed that pipeline to make sure that the demand of the organizations for procurement professionals, we can actually supply that. I think currently there are a lot of, to use a quote of one of my good friends, there's a lot of practitioners but not enough professionals.
A lot of practitioners, not enough professionals. Lillian, let's get your response.
Couldn't agree more. See, my husband's an engineer, for example. When he goes into a conversation and says he's an engineer, everybody nods and they understand exactly what that is. When I step up to the plate and I say I'm a procurement and supply chain professional, they're like, what's that? Help me understand what that is. So to the point that Andre is making, absolutely providing a license to operate for people who are in procurement and supply chain, who have credentials which are then backed up by certification that says, I have the right training, experience, exposure. I understand the finances behind procurement and supply chain. I understand commercial and legality around contracts. I understand stakeholder management and a plethora of other things which are embodied in the SIPS training and curriculum. Then bringing to the table highly skilled resources who are then responsible for procurement and supply chain, I think is very important.
Dinesh?
So I think in terms of the pipeline, I can't agree more on that one. But I think the issues we are still have on the table is we don't have skills on the ground. So the pipeline is going to generate and try to leverage and make the gap a little bit shorter. But the issues on the ground is we don't have the right skills at the moment to really make this procurement as a strategic function of the organizations. So the gap still exists there. So maybe the pipeline will take a little bit of time to bridge that gap, but currently the issues is on the table. Our standard benchmarking economies, we look within BRICS nations altogether. India, such of a nation, is generating 2 million supply chain professionals every year. And we are sitting with small kind of feeder that goes from various universities and organizations like SIPs into the professions. We are way, way short.
Would we see government represented in SIPS Africa? I'm particularly asking because of the vulnerability to low-skilled professionals who are sitting in procurement positions that are vulnerable to fraud and corruption.
Absolutely. More and more as we engage our colleagues across continent or across the continent, more and more people and governments actually engage us to assist them to modernize procurement within government. And I think you alluded to the fact that we've got fantastic regulation, not only in South Africa, but across Africa, but it is not always does not always create an enabling environment. So we see a lot of governments actually approaching us to assist them to modernize procurement within the public sector, meaning to make the rules and regulations more understandable and more conducive to effective bottom line procurement.
Let me also maybe draw from a recent South African example with the proposed establishment of the tender board, if I recall. I'm not sure if it's been implemented yet. Dinesh, number one, does that make sense that you have a centralized body through which large-scale procurement processes are going to go through? And number two, and I'd really like you to take this question on as well, to what extent will this work in terms of reducing fraud and corruption? My understanding is that's its main mandate.
True. So, Nuzipo, very nice question to ask altogether in current context of that extra spend we are doing in the country. So, centralization of a government procurement activities through a body, and we're talking about so many government departments, 280 plus municipalities altogether, so many provincial bodies, so many SOEs has to go through a centralized tender board process. I think from a concept point of view makes sense, but to implement and make it efficient, to really have the lead time. So how quickly you turn a tender around from a lead time of drafting a tender to awarding to someone is the real process that we map. So how long is this string is altogether? So I think they need to really capacitate this tender board if they want to go ahead with this one altogether to make it efficient for the local authorities to there. We had a similar example of Kauting Shared Service Center with Department of Energy, Department of Education, Department of Health, and some other departments coming together at a provincial level, centralizing the procurement process. It worked in certain sense, it didn't work because the capacity they built up, it wasn't up to the standard of they want to run the volumes through that one out.
Dinesh is worried about the lead times. Lillian, is there anything else that keeps you awake at night about this proposed board that will come to fruition?
Well, I think it's a step in the right direction in terms of its intent. So I agree with Dinesh in that respect. And I think as an African continent, we have to find local solutions for our own uniquely African issues. In the same context, I think we have an opportunity also to leverage global solutions to similar situations, because this is not uniquely necessarily African of a problem, what we're trying to solve for here. From my past experience working in the US, there is an organization called the General Services Administration, which is an organization sitting within the federal environment, and its responsibility is to run tenders, if you will, but not necessarily for one-off sort of tender opportunities within any agency, but to run them across the industry for different types of goods and services that the organizations within the government buy. And what it does, it negotiates deals, say, with the large organizations, the IBMs, the Dells, etc. And then from that pricing list is available to the various agencies to pick on at will because the price is already negotiated. To me, that's something that we probably could look at, to the point that Dinesh was making, in the sustainability realm. As we become more mature, that's a direction I would really like to see us go into.
So global example coming through. Andre, let me get a quick comment before I get my final comment from Dinesh. A quick comment on this board. Where do you think the focus should be if we are to see the efficiencies that both Lillian and Dinesh have spoken about?
Well, if you can allow me just to maybe take one step back, I think the one step that we did take in the right direction as a country is that we appointed a Chief Procurement Officer sitting at National Treasury. So a lot of those initiatives will then be coordinated through that office. And yes, a central tender board is maybe an idea that we can look at, but it will take some doing to actually get it right, especially in terms of those lead times that Dinesh mentioned.
Dinesh, I have a final minute, and I know one of the things that are keeping you awake at night is the global trends that we're seeing, that you're saying are not actually filtering through to the African continent and to the South African context. Let's get some insight on that.
True, right, Nazipo. And I think we started with the initiative last month about creating a center of excellence in Africa to bring some of these global trends into the local continent altogether, so that we can localize, we can share learning, we can create a platform for organizations, public and private, to learn from there as well. Some of the trends we looked at, like where we talk about smart BPO overseas, we are still working very much around a category management inside altogether. Where we talk about real-time spend monitoring on the other side, we are talking about a data transparency on our side. So we are very apart. And again, I think coming back to my initial point of maturity, we sit in a different maturity bracket. So some of these global trends that are widely accepted in the organizations outside Africa are not fully applicable in the local continent. But the center of excellence that we have created within KPMG is a step forward to localize and customize those global trends that work for Africa organizations as such.
And that's where we leave it for tonight. A very big thank you to my guests, Dr. Dinesh Kumar, Associate Director and Head of Procurement Advisory at KPMG, Lillian Karuri-Magero, South African Head for Sourcing at Barclays Africa Group Limited, and Andre Kutsia, Managing Director at SIPS Africa. Please don't forget to send us your comments. The details are on the screen. But for now, Bruce Whitfield is standing by to bring you Tonight with Bruce. From myself and the Invest Africa team, it's goodbye for now.